Hello and welcome to an Omagh Literary Festival event we're calling Discovering Your Voice and Finding an Audience. Later we'll be hearing from performance poet Cat Brogan and listening to a few of her pieces, and as she explains how her voice has changed over the years. We'll also be hearing from Sarah Grimes and her guests as they talk about Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman and discuss how new audiences are still discovering it today. And then we'll be hearing from Nuala Casey as she shares more of her music with us. But first, I'm delighted to be joined here by Sue Divin, author of Guard Your Heart, and Michelle Gallen, author of Big Girl Small Town. Thank you both for being here.
Great to be here, thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sue, if I can start with you. Guard Your Heart is a novel that starts very fast and immediately touches on big themes such as sectarianism, divide and peace and conflict. You grew up in Northern Ireland, you've experienced as a peace worker, and you've studied these issues throughout your life. What is it that you think has most influenced your voice as a writer?
I think I'm definitely much more of a school of life person and a pragmatist rather than an academic when it comes to stuff like that. I mean, I think for me, studying peace and conflict was much more a ticket to actually getting into a job where I could work in that field that I wanted to do. So yeah, I grew up in Armagh, and I've lived in Derry now for the last 20 years, so I'm kind of a hybrid of both those places, a long-term blow-in. I think what influenced my creative voice was probably now and life now and my work now as opposed to anything in the past. I mean, Guard Your Heart isn't a book about the Troubles. It's a book about where we're at now in the peace process, in the legacy of the Troubles. And, I started writing it in summer 2016 when the book is set. So it was always a now piece of work that doesn't really want to look backwards. It's trying to say where are we at now and look forwards from that. If anything in my past or my own life experience, and it's that thing of write what you know or what you know emotionally. I mean, this has milked everything I knew. But the one thing I'd say in terms of voice was I had quite a broad background growing up in the Troubles, which was something that not many people would have had, and at that stage in Northern Ireland. And I think because of that, because I was often in, cross-community settings where I was very much a minority within that mainly, I learned how to keep quiet and to listen to what I was hearing around me a lot of the time and absorb the fact that there were different perspectives. And that carried on as well, actually, into my professional life when I was working as a teacher, when I was working in community relations or peace work with communities. Your role there is very much to help other people find their voice and to think through things. You're a facilitator. You're not there for your own voice. So I think probably what happened to me in 2016 when I started writing was that sense of frustration of I need an outlet for what I have absorbed here, and that's what went into the creative writing, because it was a safe way for me to express what I saw around me.
Well, before we hear any more, would you like to share a passage from the book and a reading for us?
Sure. As you said, that it does touch on big themes, and one of the things was working in peace and reconciliation was the decade of centenaries, the 100 years anniversary. So this is probably the only bit in the novel that directly references that kind of link, and this is a scene where Aidan and Iona, the two teenage 18-year-olds, are actually visiting an exhibition in Belfast City Hall, which was a real exhibition, and they're not going out or anything, they're just trying to suss each other out a wee bit. We drifted to a glass exhibition case full of museum tack, handwritten letters, black and white photographs, medals and military cloth badges. It was only when we glanced closer it caught us. They belonged to one family, two individuals from back then. He was a prod who'd done the signing and blood thing and joined the Ulster Volunteer Force. She was a Catholic and had been in Common to Man, kind of woman's bit of the IRA. She'd helped the Rising, he'd survived the Somme and Messines. A match made in hell, yet after Ireland tore itself apart, they met in Belfast and got hitched. There was a faded family photo. That's mental. I studied the three kids in the image. Iona was hunkered down reading love letters scrawled on yellowed paper. Imagine their conversations over breakfast, I said. It's like people like us getting together during the Troubles. Miraculous. Their families would have been killing each other. Can you imagine trying to make that work? I glanced at Iona, then gulped, realising what I'd said. It was the first time I'd seen her blush, the rose colour spreading across her cheekbones beautifully. For a split second her eyes connected before she looked away and moved to a different part of the exhibition. Something changed. My feet were stuck, but my gaze followed her. From the far side of the room she stole another glance at me, and our eyes connected with a brief intensity I hadn't felt before. This time it was my turn to look away, confused by the unexpected wave of warmth rising as I missed a breath. It caught me unaware. Staring at my reflection in the cabinet, I wondered if I'd misread her. Was it possible to misread my own reaction? I glanced over again, trying to make sense of it. She had her back to me now, the creamy skin of her neck brushed by her long brown hair. From the little I knew of her, being dolled up to the nines wasn't her style, but the bottle green cotton jumper naturally hugged her frame, and she could have been a dancer in the slim black leggings. I smiled, clocking her sweet DMs and rainbow shoelaces again, like her kick-ass statement to the world. Another wave of emotion poured through me as I observed her with fresh eyes before turning. Jesus, Hennessy. 2 hours ago, I'd been engrossed in thinking about Shannon as we trekked to the accommodation office. An hour ago, I'd been in teenage heaven hell, fathoming ribbed sensitive or safe. There was nothing safe about this. My hand tapped my chest pocket as my mind tried to refocus on what was real, that I was meeting Shannon tomorrow night, that I had been rehearsing an attempted apology for days, that thinking of her even now still fired my bloodstream. I sensed Iona back at my side and worked to blank my chaos before turning. She smiled, all calm, like it was only me on the roller coaster. Our bus will be heading soon, she said, her voice steady. 2 stained glass windows caught her attention in the corridor as we left City Hall. The first was an old factory scene in shades of blue, backed with rainbow shards. Not as Catholics or Protestants, not as nationalists or unionists, but as Belfast workers standing together. The second was for the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, the Catholics and Protestants who'd crossed the Pyrenees to volunteer in the fight against Franco. We'd done it in history class, no passaran. I muttered the words from a song about it as I reflected. She looked at me, seeking an explanation. It's a Christy Moore song. I sang the lyrics low about remembering the volunteers who died fighting the dictator. Her expression didn't change. In the name of God, haven't you heard of Christy Moore? Seriously? He's only one of the best-known singer-songwriters in Ireland. God, we really were worlds apart. You sing nice, she said. Lost in our own thoughts, we wove our way on the grey pavements past the mandolins, whistles and guitars of Matchett's music shop to the Europa bus station. Between those last 2 stained glass windows in City Hall had hung a Celtic watercolour of 5 portraits, its message decreed bilingually in orange lettering. Ar Scal Héla a Virus Nadini. It is in the shelter of each other that people live.
Thank you. It's a beautiful reading, and I think in that passage we're hearing from Aidan.
Yep.
But of course throughout the book you've 2 sort of very alternating narrators almost. It's nearly chapter about, I think, with between Aidan and Iona, and with those 2 very distinctive voices, did you find writing it that one voice came more naturally than the other, or how did you deal with that process?
Absolutely. Right from the start, Aidan was there. I mean, he was the dominant character. I think at the start it was mainly his story because he had the most to lose. You know, he was the one that was really in tough family circumstances, difficult community, set in a lot of poverty, violence and things going on there. And he just came and inhabited my head and wouldn't leave for 2 years, you know, and he came with his own soundtrack as well. He used to listen to Cedarwood Road from U2 and the Congos, you know, Come With Me Now, all, you know, anything rock, slightly alternative and a minor key, that was just him. And, you know, I'd be out for a walk or in a restaurant and he would just invade my head with lines, you know, like I'd have been a bloody brilliant writer if I'd been born in the Troubles, you know, that kind of stuff. And you're just like, I need a notebook, write this down. And so he was easy. Iona I really struggled with, and the difficulty there was that, you know, Aidan at the start in early drafts used to have slightly more chapters than Iona, and then when it got to the point that I thought, no, the structure of this is going to be alternate chapters, there was kind of a moment of revelation where I thought, actually what's going wrong here is Iona's not a strong enough kick-ass kind of character to work for Aidan unless I can get her right. The whole book will be out of kilter. And it was that sort of, you know, you would know the writer's thing of make bad things happen to your characters if you want them to come alive. So once I thought, okay, Iona needs her own plot arc, I'm going to have to make some more bad stuff happen to her so that she can then react. And once I did that, she came out, you know, and really kicking back, and that worked.
I think you're right, because there's nothing worse than a book where one voice really sings to you and there's almost a voice that doesn't work, and you're turning the page and there's a chapter and a voice that you're almost disappointed. You're like, I need to get through this to get to the other one.
Absolutely.
So I wonder, was there ever a stage where you thought that the book could be just Aidan's voice, or did you feel that it was important to the story that the two protagonists had shared?
Yeah, well, I think it was important to the story ultimately, because what I wanted to show was the range of perspectives that exist in the north of Ireland today, and to do that, really, it needed to have two characters from very different backgrounds to actually carry that in their perspectives. But also all the subsidiary characters are really important in the novel as well, because they're representing types of people I would come across a lot as well, and they all have their own place too.
Great. I mean, it's good. I think it's so successful in the book, and it manages to, in your book, when the chapter ends, it almost feels natural. You sort of think the story does require now that we hear from the other side, and it flows together brilliantly. Michelle, there's so much to discuss about the voice in your novel, but I want to start by asking you, because you've said that you felt compelled to write about issues of the border and about, you know, issues with the Troubles. I'm wondering, has that always been what drove you towards writing, or was it what drove you in particular to this book?
I don't think that the Troubles drove me to write, but that's what I grew up in, and it was completely my childhood experience. And the rural area I grew up in was like divided by the border. My family lived on the border, so the whole idea of writing anything but what I knew was a bit strange. I mean, I'm not sure how I would have started writing if I'd had to write about, I don't know, living in a glamorous city somewhere where the sun was always shining and you could eat croissants and orange juice all day. So I wrote about what I knew, and I grew up in the countryside. I grew up really devout Catholic household, and I grew up in a very troubled time. So that's where I started. And I think one of the things that was really important to me as a writer actually wasn't writing in the first instance, but there's a strong sort of Shanachie tradition in my house. So we would have gone to my grandmother's house, and the TV would just go straight off, and you get your cups of tea, and everybody would, you know, sit around, and first of all you'd have the gossip, right? You get the gossip out of the way, and then you'd move into something like, oh sure, I took the turf home now, we got it in, thank God. But you remember the time that you cut your finger off up in the bog there, and then you'd go off into some story about something or other. And so we had a lot of kind of storytelling, and a lot of it was really funny, but then there was quite often really tragic or really dark stories sort of woven in between these funny stories. And I think that set me off in the past to storytelling. But as a kid, you don't get to tell your stories around the fire the way the adults do, so I started writing them down. So short stories led me to Big Girl Small Town, because I'd written a collection of short stories, and the last one was set in a chipper, and it had a guy called Cormac in it, and he was like a single lad. His dad had disappeared. He had an alcoholic or alcohol-dependent mother. And when I was finished writing that short story, I was like, I just don't want to stop this world. but it wasn't his voice that I wanted to write in. I wanted to write in the voice of his co-worker called Magella, who actually was completely silent in the short story, but was in my head. And I took a month off work and wrote 70,000 words in a month. Back at a time when you could take a month off work and you didn't have children and you could afford cheap rent in Belfast. So I guess Shanachie storytelling moved into short story writing, which became a novel.
Wonderful. Well, if you're happy to share some of
I can.
Magella's world with us,
I'll give you a wee bit of Magella's world. So Magella works she's a big girl who lives in a small town and she works in a chipper. And one of the things that Magella has is she's neurodiverse. She's probably autistic but undiagnosed, autistic female. And she has this list of stuff she doesn't like and this list of stuff that she loves that kind of keeps her going. So it's 9:29 p.m. in the chipper, and item 3.4 on her list is noise, shite, singing. Magella looked up as the buzzer went. Arlene, Darlene and Jolene Logue trooped into the takeaway. Jolene had her wee cub by the hand, and the whole lot of them were all dollied up in their country and western gear. Magella? Lou, Magella. Hiya, missus. Magella nodded at the sisters. Hi, yes. The girls stopped to check out the menu board and Magella threw her eye over them. The sequins on their outfits sparkled under the flickery light. Magella always wondered where the Logues got their clothes. It was maybe on eBay. She was pretty sure they weren't getting them in Patterson's Patterns in the town or New Look in Strabane. The wee denim shirts with the spangly bits and the glittery belly tops and the cowgirl hats and the fancy leather boots. It was like something you'd see on some daft American TV show. And they even had the wee fella dickied up like a miniature cowboy, for he was part of their act. Marty had explained the country and western was in their blood, for their father had been a big man at the singing before he'd had the accident and took to the painkillers. Magella picked up her pen as Arlene came over to the counter. What can I get yous? Can I get a fish supper with a can of Coke? Daddy burger and a can of Fanta and a Kitty's chicken nugget special meal for the wee man here. No bother. Onion rings and garlic mushrooms and chips for me, Jella, thanks. Jolene was the vegetarian in the family and knew better than to order veggie burgers. Coming up. Magella straightened up and headed to the back to pass the order to Jan Paul. Marty came out of the storeroom. Busy? No, just the Logue cuddies in. The Logue cuddies, you say? Yeah! Marty pulled out his imaginary lasso and circled it in the air, and he lassoed Magella and he started tugging her towards him. Magella knew she was supposed to let herself be tugged along for a few steps and then they'd have a laugh. Oh, she just stood there awkwardly feeling like a heifer. Oh, you're no crack at all, and ain't Jella. Magella wanted to explain, but instead she shrugged and walked back out to the counter. The three Logue girls were standing at the window seat practising their harmonies and the vocal twangs, while the wee fella nodded along under his Stetson, seeming to agree that sometimes it is hard to be a woman.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, hearing that reading, you hear the sort of distinctive voice and the familiar language maybe to a lot of us, but you know, to different readers maybe not so familiar. And I noticed on your website you have a section of sort of a book club guide to the book, and it includes a glossary of sort of some of the slang language that is used in the voice. Was that a decision you had to make, and did you find that you had to use that sort of colloquial language in order to tell that story?
I think actually the first draft was written just in dialect, just completely in almost phonetically rendered, and while I was editing it I had to try and make a decision to make Magella's voice in conversation or basically any dialogue stays very much written as it would be said in Tyrone, but then I had to try and keep the narrative a little less local, just to make sure that readers could get on board. So it was really hard to strike that balance between being pure Tyrone and trying to make sure people outside of Tyrone would get you, like, because even people in Derry get a bit confused at times with our Tyrone accent. But I had to do the glossary for the Americans. So when it went out in America, we had to like send a package and a little we print out a glossary, and then we had to put it on the website so that they could click play on some of the words. And book clubs, when I've done a few book clubs with Americans, they like me to say things. off the glossary too. So it's gone down well. I think there's a lot of people, say in America, who either would have parents or relatives who would be familiar with Northern Ireland. So when they hear the accent or see it written down, they love it. And then there's people, obviously immigrants themselves, who say, oh my God, I haven't heard that since I was home. But yeah, the way I spoke growing up, the way I've always spoken at home is really, really important to me.
And I mean, maybe Sue, you could speak to this as well. And that when you're writing something, do you ever, maybe you never think of the audience at all, but if you do you think about what a local audience knows and maybe what a wider audience won't know? And I'm thinking with you, in terms of writing about the Troubles, do you ever feel I don't need to explain that, but maybe if I'm speaking to an audience outside of Ireland, I do? Is that something you consider when you're writing?
I don't know about you, but like when I'm writing, I just write it the way I want it to be, first of all. But usually it's when you're going through edits with an editor and they're thinking of how they're going to market the book and where the audience is going to be, that you then have to go through it. So definitely, I mean, the editors knew they were pitching to an audience wider than just Northern Ireland. So it had to work not just in all of the island of Ireland and all of the UK. They wanted it to be able to work further afield as well. So there certainly were things that were edited where, you know, I was told, look, could you put another wee line in there? We don't quite get what that reference is about, you know, or, you know, there was the debates over the words. Like, you definitely couldn't mention 15s because nobody outside Northern Ireland knew what a 15 was, which is a real shame. You know, but there was also the kind of, you know, if you've referred to him as being pissed there. Now, could you consider saying drunk? Because if you're in America, pissed means angry, unless he's pissed drunk or unless he was blootered, or, you know, and you would work through, you know. And another one that came up a lot was people that were dandering here and there and everywhere, and it's like, can you use dandering because it doesn't mean the same in England? Maybe it should be wandering, you know, or something that's wild bad, you know. Those are the kind of things we edited, but we edited also just to make sure it was accessible, so the reader, particularly because this is for young adults as well as adults, a reader with no prior knowledge of Northern Ireland could still read it and get it. You know, I don't know what about
it's
you?
something similar, I think, Sue, but maybe less so, because if you've an undiagnosed autistic female, one of the great things about Majella is she's often confused about the world she's living in already, and she's very pleased when her co-worker Marty might explain something to her or really explain what actually just happened in front of her eyes. She also has like a Polish co-worker, and he's great because he doesn't get anything, and there's a whole scene in the book where everybody has to explain to him, you know, 30 different words for being drunk and that you use in Tyrone. I mean, at least 30. I know people have emailed me corrections to let me know I hadn't included all of the words for drunk that we use in Tyrone. But I think that's the thing, is finding this fine balance between making sure your book is accessible to as many readers as possible, so our stories and our voices are out there, while not compromising to the extent that local people are a little bit annoyed. Yeah. They're like, oh, well, I know what we're talking, why are you explaining that to me? I know what a heifer is. And you're like, going, not everyone knows what a heifer is. But this is where things like glossaries are great, or if you have people reading on ebooks as well. I mean, it's just so easy to tap and say, explain that to me, please.
There's also a wonderful thing, I think it's a great way to discover language, is if you read it in a book and the context explains it for you. It's just
there's a lot of that goes on when you're at it, just to make sure.
Well, there was also Nicola Coughlin did the audiobook for this, and the Americans loved that because they'd all got addicted to Dairy Girls, and they kind of got used to some of the, and that's another thing about having the great good luck to have somebody like Anna Burns breaking out in Northern Ireland. I mean, Anna Burns has been working for years and years, and then you had Dairy Girls come out, and people just had so much more, I think, more patience and a little bit more context and understanding. So then when Nicola did the audiobook for this, that was a really great way of getting readers on board and getting particularly the Americans to get into the world and to kind of get permission to laugh. Sometimes we are quite dark, I think. Sometimes I think we are quite dark and challenging in our
self-depreciation humour.
And sometimes when you read it, and if you're not sure of the culture, you might think, really, people would laugh, that's a joke. But Nicola really brought that kind of like laughing at darkness out, you know.
Well, it's a very it's an interesting process, I'm sure, that you've both been in. So you mentioned before that you started writing this in 2016, and I think you've said before that you thought this could be a stronger power to help understanding. You thought fiction had that power. I wonder now, having published the book, how do you feel about that? And do you think that readers in Northern Ireland do look to fiction as a process of understanding?
Yeah, I think the quote that I had said was that fiction is a powerful tool for creating empathy, and empathy is a powerful tool for creating peace. And I still hold to that I do think a lot of the peace work that we do in Northern Ireland that I've experienced over the years works when we humanise the other, whatever that other happens to be in a given situation, and people connect then on a level of humanity, whereas if it's just issues that they're debating about, there's a distance and a remoteness from that. So I do think that fiction, whether it's a novel or whether it's flash fiction or whether it's performance poetry or whatever, it creates that empathy that's really powerful. As to whether people in Northern Ireland are looking to explore that, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if anybody asked Shakespeare, do you want to read Romeo and Juliet to learn about Shakespearean times in Verona? But I don't think necessarily you have to be looking to understand the big issues in Northern Ireland to want to read Guard Your Heart. I hope people will read it for the story. I hope people will read it because it's a page turner with two teenagers from opposite sides of the tracks in difficult circumstances. I would love it when they get to the end, they feel they've actually absorbed something else. Yeah. And that's the feedback. I mean, if I just quote you one person that I don't know, who was a young reader who posted a review in Goodreads, and they said for the first time in reading a book, they felt seen. They felt that somebody got what their generation is about. That's probably more important than any of the reviews from critics and stuff.
Well, when you say that, because you've said, it's not about the troubles, but something different. I thought one of the wonderful things I found when reading it was that you have this sort of Romeo and Juliet angle, but they're the two protagonists are the two that are least aware of it. They're very conscious of the fact that this shouldn't be a problem and it's not a problem for us. And it's subtle to the issue, and it doesn't it doesn't play up to the issue. It sort of shows you that it is different now than it would have been.
Yeah, and it's
in a different time.
It's also trying to capture the complexity of peace. So I guess partly the novel for the wider readership was a bit of reaction against the people that come in from outside, wherever that outside is, and say, it's just Catholics and Protestants, would you just get over yourselves? And they don't say that to other movements that are trying to show historical, political, cultural stuff. And I think this hopefully helps people get it a bit more as well.
Michelle, we've been talking about, and we'll be talking throughout this event, about writers finding their voice and then finding an audience. You, before publishing your novel, a lot of your short stories had appeared in journals and anthologies, and I'm interested in how you found your journey to publication and finding an audience that way.
I think the thing that helped me most really in my life was, again, starting off in a family of storytellers, and you can tell immediately which story captures somebody's attention and which story makes people laugh, which story makes somebody cry. So there was that. When I moved to Belfast years ago, I got on, there was a performance poetry scene, which was very anarchic but great crack, really good fun. And I was also in a couple of writers' groups. There was a Queen's writers' group, and then we had a writers' group that spun out of the Crescent Arts Centre. And these writers' groups really told me, almost you learn everything you need to know about the piece you're workshopping when you're reading it, and you're tuning into what people are doing around the table and whether or not somebody's really involved in it. Because people often might say something quite nice about your work afterwards if you're in a really polite group. But when you feel that you're reading something out, first of all, you catch the mistakes yourself, but also you feel if you've captured people around you. And it's the same as if when you're at a performance poetry night and everybody's got other things to do, mostly drinking. If you're able to stand up there and capture somebody with your story or with your words, then I think you're onto something. So for me, literary journals and anthologies always felt quite cold, because you might send 10 things off and hear nothing, send 100 things off, get one acceptance. And that would feel nice, but to stand up in a room full of people and know that when you tell your story or you read to them, that they're listening and they love it, then that to me gave me validation I needed to write a book. So I would tell, if you're the right sort of personality for it, I would really encourage people to attend performances and to try and participate in performances of all kinds, of all shapes. Doesn't have to be big, huge performances, but even taking your stuff out in a pub and having a read of it. So
yeah. I have to ask you finally both about the Irish Writers' Centre Novel Fair, which played such a significant part for both of you. So if you want to start, just tell us a bit about that process.
Sure, yeah. We were both actually in the same year, in the same room, pitching to the same agents.
That's where we met.
Yeah, it is where we met, And it was great crack because for anybody that doesn't know the novel fair, it's basically the biggest kind of Dragon's Den type opportunity for an unpublished novelist to pitch your novel to agents and publishers. If you get through, there's usually about 300 odd people put in a novel, and if you get through to the final 12, you're considered a winner. There's no kind of outright winner on it. And the prize is that you sit for a day and you pitch to about 15, was it?
15,
like agents and publishers direct. And then you go for a few pints afterwards, and you hope to God that you're going to get some positive emails coming in the next 2 months. You know, and I had to wait about 6 weeks before I got a positive one. So you do get a lot of rejections as well, and you just have to weather that and keep hoping, you know. But it was a great day, and I would encourage any unpublished novelist that has a novel to enter it and give it a shot, you know. What about you?
Absolutely. No, exactly the same. And I think the only thing I would add to it was the place I met you and quite a few other writers who are still in my even despite COVID, still in my world, and still people I turn to. So that idea again of connecting with people and, you know, being able to just say, oh my God, I have something coming out, or even saying, I had this thing with my editor and I'm not sure about it. All this kind of, the sort of really specifics of being in writing. But yeah, I think the Irish Writers' Centre has a fantastic network and does a really good job of giving people a platform.
And then I wonder, just to finish, when we're talking about that, and if you think back to the day when you were down pitching to editors, does it feel a bit surreal looking back? What's the journey been like in the time since then? Yeah,
for me it was mad, and that was partly because I was completely out of it. I had just come back from Togo, and I was dosed with paracetamol and anti-malarials and all the preparation you're not supposed to do. That was me, whereas she was like ultra organised. So it was two totally different personalities, but ended up sitting next to each other. I mean, I have great memories of that day because it's one of the few things that you enter that when you get to the final, you're not competing.
Yeah.
You've won it already. You're there with 12 others who are the same as you.
Yeah.
And you're in it as a team almost. And I really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, it's the same. It's just sitting in a room. And I can remember when I realised I was A, beside the window, and B, beside Sue. I was like, oh my God, this is so good. This is the place I need to be, because you kept getting these little breaks. And it was very intense, wasn't it?
It's like speed dating with agents and publishers.
15 minutes.
That's 15 minutes.
Yeah. And then you get these little breaks, and there were just enough time to check in to make sure that we were all keeping going. But no, it was brilliant. It was a really fantastic experience, start to finish. So
brilliant. Well, look, Sue, Michelle, I'm sure a lot of people watching will have already read your books, will be aware of them. If they haven't, I'm sure what you've said here will hopefully
wonderful
encourage.
Wonderful present.
Look at that.
More people. So there's nothing more for me to say, but thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much for having us.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, my name is Cat Brogan. I'm from Omagh, and I'm delighted to be here at the Omagh Literary Festival honouring Benedict Kiley. I'm a performance poet, and I'm going to share with you some poems that I've written, and also a little bit of my journey as a writer and as a performer and getting my work out into the world, and my inspirations behind writing as well. So I'm going to kick off with a little poem that I wrote about my mum, and I think very often it all comes back to your mother. And whenever I left home when I was 18, and this is a little reflection on some of the things my mum passed on to me. Pairing socks, orphaned, splayed out on my parents' flowery duvet. My job was to pair them. We had a bag of singles that lived in the hot press. Some escaped, others joined. The action of balling together two separate articles must have been tricky for Mum's paralysed hand, like the words she failed to pair, pulling commands from a brain of separated synapses. Catherine, washing, dinner, uniform, now. I stopped pairing my socks when I started doing my own laundry, when I no longer had my parents' bed to display the singletons like a light box for the x-ray, where the nurse failed to find a match for the pain Mum felt on the half of her that was lost. 10 years of solo laundry later, I rediscover my conditioning and I pair my socks. So I think often a poem comes from a moment, from an emotion, from that feeling of being connected back to another memory and through connections. And I think because my mother has aphasia, she had a head injury when she was 20. She had to relearn how to read and write and speak. And much of my life growing up, I was always trying to preempt the end of her sentences that she couldn't quite get to. And being able to sort of have this appreciation of language, of how amazing it is to just open your mouth and for words to come out, the exact words that you want to come out. And my mum would just have this very sort of set phrases and things that she would say that would help her with her aphasia. And I think that always gave me an appreciation of language and how valuable it is and how much we need it. And also about ways to connect beyond language. So something else that's really inspired me in my writing throughout the years is, of course, coming from Northern Ireland, coming from Omagh. And this is a piece that I wrote about the Ulster American folk, not the Ulster American Folk Park, that's something else, the Ulster American project that I was sent on back in 2000, I think it was. 15 years old, JFK. Was the second time I saw black people slumped behind counters, wheeling mop buckets, whites holding briefcases, we teens brought to witness integration, opportunity, banging like a bailiff, a nation unbombed under one flag. In my home place, tricolours tatter above Gaelic pitches. The next village lynches Union Jacks from lampposts. The fingernails of the Ulster American Project coordinator paraded stars and stripes. She didn't get the Troubles, like it was a satellite channel. Wouldn't speak to Mormons. Immigrants must learn English. The strawberried 4th of July cake made us the losers, bonfiring the 12th orange. Till my host spilled, if you haven't contemplated suicide by the time you're 11, there's something wrong with you. Mental illness bawled in the ropes course bathroom. An asylum the chubby American, not yet lesbian, had been a patient in. Self-harm and Ellen went over my head like British Army helicopters. My dad declined the post-bomb counsellor. I saw everyone has troubles. They just don't get a capital T or a troubles trip to Salt Lake City troubled teens. And I think a lot of my writing, having been out of Northern Ireland for so long, has been a way to seek to understand, to be able to explain or to give meaning or find form and pattern in something which is very traumatic and violent. And I think there's something about writing that makes sense of the world that we're in and helps us to reconcile with it as well. Something else which has really inspired my writing is sexuality. And I think growing up as a LGBT person in the 90s and early 2000s in Omagh, it was very difficult to have any kind of role models or really understand my sexuality in many ways. And like there wasn't the internet and stuff. The internet was like broadband, and it was internet was before broadband. It was dial-up, and it was it was like the family desktop in your living room where everyone could see. And also something that's inspired me more recently is spirituality and shamanism. And I think that when you're an artist, you are connected with energy, and with the energy that sometimes just comes into you from you don't know where it is, and that comes out of you as an artist and connects with an audience, and the energy coming back from the audience again, and being able to see how we're connected through that and connected through art and through creation. So it's fingers crossed we'll soon be able to do that in a live way, because I think there's nothing quite like having an audience. So anyone who's tuning in, thank you very much for being my audience. And this is Cross. I am the shaman, for the ghosts of my brethren, the souls who cannot cross over, who linger to watch over lovers they passed off as sisters. I am the drum, welcoming them to the threshold, to let go, to choose to be reborn in a body that can marry, raise a family, attend an orgy. I am the ferry for queer shadows to rest in guided gondolas after hidden journeys. I beat to release the shades at the docks, call in the north, the south, the east, the west, launch ancestors to new life in Provincetown, Brighton, even Dublin. In Malaysia, cars are boudoirs. Her mother will never scroll our wedding photographs. My lover will always check when I grasp legitimate hand-holding opportunities like crossing the road as offerings summoned from the cauldrons of guides. And so after spending 8 years in London, I went to Malaysia, and I've just come back from 5 years there. So definitely that experience of being a queer person in a country where it is illegal to be gay very much influenced my work, and also my work in terms of organising events, hosting, putting on shows. The last year and a half I've been doing all sorts of live streams and all that as well, and trying to adapt to this changing landscape of a nature of events. And I think that that's also been a big part of my creative process, is having a community, feeling like I'm not some artist in isolation, like in the attic, nobody talk to me. I'm someone who reacts to what is going on around me and is inspired by the sort of the feed from the community. And also another thing is really a lot of spending time away from Omagh and thinking back about what is about what it means to come from this place. And this poem was inspired by Carl Duffy originally, her poem originally, about sort of coming from Scotland to England and the sense of your voice changing, your mouth changing, and connecting back with that history and that past. And this poem was also inspired by a really old photograph that we've got of my, I think it's my great aunt, and she's like stood beside this like awesome haystack, and she's just there like owning the haystack. And yeah, this is called The Last Straw. My great aunt's haystack was the talk of temerity. Pitchforks are lost on me like my home place's meaning. In my native Irish, I can say the Our Father, how are you, and can I go to the toilet, despite summer schools and an A at GCSE. Language was a baby tooth to shed, immigration the answer to feeding 10 kids on a boggy hillside, stolen, then rented back to you. When I forgot the national anthem, something stirred, like a filling that didn't fit, my tongue a rake that I had no muscles to lift. And I'm back now, back in Omagh, and it's in Derry actually, and my partner's just joined me, which is wonderful. And I think whenever you're in a sort of transnational, when you're with somebody who's from a different country, there's a whole other set of translation that happens and trying to understand each other's backgrounds. And definitely like Ireland and Malaysia are so different, and that sort of makes you look a lot harder at like who you are and where you're from. And I think that's what we do in writing and in creating, is that we interrogate the edges and the stress points. And while I was waiting for my partner to join me, I was I was very worried that she wasn't going to be able to hack it, that it was going to be too cold and she wasn't going to get the food that she loved. And I think a lot of time writing comes out of that sort of anxiety as well. And again, these everyday moments and the symbolism of things, like we put a meaning on things. And this is about trying to sort of how can I make my partner feel more at home in Northern Ireland, and will it work for her? And also, again, it comes back to my mother. I think having been brought up by a disabled mother, and in the last 10 years, she hasn't been very well. And that's a constant. I think that's something that many people are familiar with, that feeling of wanting to be there to help your ailing parent, but also the frustration and the restriction that can offer in your life as well. This is called Sustenance. On the shelves of Belfast's Asian supermarket is that cinnamon tea I couldn't find out east. The only hospitality I could offer, along with dates Dad packed. That was 5 years ago when I brought her back to Maytower the night we met. From jungle palms, I've called it in, my rainy forest of fleeting bluebells and ferns unfurling by the brown bog burn. Cherry trees spring pink at the home house, where I learned from Dad, wrapping the hot water bottle with Mum's nightdress. She's an ashy pet, like my love, who wears thermals in July. But here we can kiss in lifts, hold hands in streets, maybe find home. In a small town of abattoirs and assembly lines that I left, where I put Mum to bed. Be warned, there's no Sunday here. Concrete the patio, cook dinner, wash the curtains, 'cause it's a great day for the drying. I scope the aisles, feedback on the availability of your comfort food to ease your entry, cooking up our life here, eating edamame, sipping cinnamon tea. And I think something that's always really hard about writing is ending. And something that I really like to do is sort of find a way to circle back to where I began. But it's all changed. It's all different. It's imbued with a new sense, and we're seeing it a different way. And I think that poetry makes those moments and those small incidental things, it imbues them with something sacred and meaningful. So if anybody out there wants to write and is interested in writing, the first thing to do is just write, obviously. Go to as many workshops as you can, meet other people, form communities, and really don't be afraid to go into your own specificities. I think that's what we've seen from other writers. Guard Your Heart by Sue, and with Big Girl Small Town from Michelle Gallen, that whenever you get specific, you're able to find this universality in the personal. So don't be afraid to use like what you know and your own unique set of circumstances. So I'm just going to finish with this little one about sourdough bread, and also about passing it on. So do pass it on and share with others what it is that you have to say. And sometimes it's really hard to remember the first line, and then you're grand. So don't worry about that. So this is, sometimes you just need a starter, a push, to get the line to flow, to get the dough to grow, a leg up, an introduction to the crew, and after that, it's up to you to mix, knead, fold, pay attention to time, heat, humidity, and watch it rise. From something as simple as flour and water into something so tasty it's gone in half an hour. And then you're the keeper of the culture. entrusted with the starter that must be kept living, refrigerated and fed, or thrown in the absence of recipients when time would not allow space or tools to make use of magic jars passed down the generations as bread of life that is living in the rhythm of your knuckles, in the sweat of your song, in the tap of your heel, as you keep tradition living, bubbling, rising.
Hello guys, welcome to our little chat on the third policeman for Omagh's Literary Festival. My name's Sarah, and this is Callum and Connor, and we're going to talk about this novel, but I thought I'd give a small introduction to begin with. So, much of Flann O'Brien's Third Policeman is set in another dimension, most often supposed to be hell. He describes said dimension as such. My surroundings had a strangeness of a peculiar kind, entirely separate from the mere strangeness of a country where one has never been before. Everything seemed almost too pleasant, too perfect, too finely made. Each thing the eye could see was unmistakable and unambiguous, incapable of merging with any other thing or of being confused with it. The colour of the bogs was beautiful, and the greenness of the green fields supernal. Trees were arranged here and there with far from usual consideration for the fastidious eye. The senses took keen pleasure from merely breathing the air and discharged their functions with delight. I was clearly in a strange country, but all the doubts and perplexities which strewed my mind could not stop me from feeling happy and heart-light and full of an appetite for going about my business and finding the hiding place of the black box. So for the last event that I organised for the Omagh Literary Festival, I also opened with a landscape description, one that Benedict Kiley wrote to describe William Carleton's homeland. So Kiley wrote of the Clogher Valley: under a sultry sky on a warm July day, the place has something symbolic of everything in the genius of the man that the place made. Richness and colour in the good farmed land, in the moors and occasional rocks, something unkempt and desolate and always out of control. In those blue infinite spaces, some suggestion of greatness and power, never exactly defined, never stabilised and made permanent. The fields and the bogs, the colour in the farmland are described by both writers with the same tenderness, the same love, but where O'Brien emphasises their exactitude, Kiley notes their wildness. Another Tyrone writer, John Montague, was to write an entire collection of poetry named after his townland of Garvaghey, translated into English as the Rough Field. Montague speaks of his Tyrone as having a harsh landscape that haunts me, and indeed for all of these Tyrone expat writers, Kiley, O'Brien and Montague, the fields and bogs of Tyrone dominate the text that they write from all corners of the world. So, I don't know exactly to what extent that I can make the claim that the small police barracks of the Third Policeman is modelled off a small town Tyrone police station, but for the past few months I've been living in Dunleary, O'Brien's final resting place, and I can assure you that the Third Policeman is very much a novel written by a Tyrone man rather than a South Dubliner. In fact, like, the most telling proof that this is a Tyrone novel is Sergeant Pluck's description of the man Quigley, who had a hot air balloon, was a devil for reading books, and by all accounts a Fermanagh man, which is naturally the worst of all insults. The point of this introduction has been to try and make Flann O'Brien seem more accessible. He's often been treated like some kind of high modernist, as difficult as Joyce and the Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake years, and only capable of discussion by academics. But I've invited Connor and Callum here to talk about it, as if it's a novel that they both read for a book club, and I invite you to just imagine that we're able to be in a bar with a few drinks right now to solve the mysteries of this surrealist fiction. Mm-hmm. So I guess a good point to start is just to ask you both what you thought of the book. What do you think, Callum?
Well, what I liked about the book was, which is this was debatable, was the use of footnotes. And so the main character is like a scholar and basically worships this man called De Selby, who's a fictional philosopher and physicist and inventor. And it's just constantly like jumping out of the actual prose. And in my opinion, De Selby's like, his philosophies are all too far-fetched to even like give the time of day. It's all just a bit of hokum. It's just like
bit of nonsense.
Yeah, a wee bit. So then when you jump back into it, it's like, well, this is also nonsense, but compared to that, it's a little bit, you can shed a bit of light to it. So.
Oh, and what did you think?
I definitely spent most of the book thinking that Flann O'Brien was a lot smarter than I was. I kept thinking that there was going to be a point where you tied everything together and everything made sense. But I think it's almost like Alice in Wonderland, where there's like that sort of like art of madness in it, and it's just jumps from place to place and portion to portion and mad idea to mad idea mixed in with like pseudoscience and actual science.
Yep.
And it's just a very it's very strange, but it is enjoyable to spend time in that very familiar while also very strange place.
Yeah, I think for me as well, that was a big part. It was like that's part of the intrigue, that's part of what keeps you reading, because you feel like you're figuring out something, bits and pieces, and then you're like, no. And it's the same like theory as the name of the book. It's like, it's called The Third Policeman. The third policeman doesn't show up until like 10 pages to the end of the novel, and you're like, well, there he is, cool. And it's just on to the next. There's no big thing, he's just this guy, in my opinion, but you had some theories on him.
Do you think that Policeman Fox just appears at the end because Flann O'Brien didn't want to do like a waiting for Godot kind of situation where they never shows up? Or do you think that he was like pulling the strings the whole time? Because he does say, he's like, oh yeah, I was just messing with the Omnium readings and making the other two go and check them every day and
true.
stress out about them.
So he's Flann doing that and pulling the strings. Yeah, true. But so yeah, when you meet what was his name? The
Policeman
third
Fox?
policeman? Yeah. So like there's talk of him throughout it, like slight mentions, so I think it's just the intrigue of like finding out, see if we actually find this character and if he has any part to play, really.
So like what's the purpose of this book for you guys? Like, is it just an exploration of just absolute nonsense? Or is there a reason?
So I suppose it goes into like what genre it is. We like discussed that before, and like so my conclusion was that it was a dream sequence, because I suppose we can give spoilers. Like, spoiler alert! Main character was dead the whole time, and yeah, at the end I was just like, okay. So yeah, I think it was just like a bit of fun, and then the end of it is that it was just like, well, there you go. Yeah.
But Connor, you noticed, like you were saying, that whenever he opened the box and then everything all of a sudden felt really weird and he met his soul, and you were like, oh, he died.
Yeah.
I didn't get that whenever I read it until the very end. I was like, oh.
But it was like O'Brien, like himself, wrote about it being like a new idea in the 1960s.
No,
40s.
1940s.
Okay, wrote about the idea that like your protagonist is a dead man for the entire novel, and I actually think that's perhaps sort of like maybe a trope that is now far more common, is the sort of they were dead all along, the Sixth Sense thing. Spoiler for Sixth Sense.
So many spoilers.
But yeah, because like that, the book takes like a very very real change at that point, and from that point on, it sort of like starts like almost like watching a painting melt. It's sort of everything becomes far more surreal. And yeah, I think it was pretty explicit, but it's very hard to tell because it is so strange and so surreal. You have no idea like where you're actually located for a good deal of it.
Yeah.
So I think the thing, we mentioned genre there, it's kind of difficult to categorize. I'm coming at this book from a literary academic perspective. You're like, oh, this is just like high modernism or postmodernism or surrealist fiction. But none of those things are necessarily readable, usually.
True.
But I think this book is quite readable, and it's definitely nonsense in that Alice in Wonderland kind of way that you were talking about, where it's an actual good story. What do you think? Like, is this book worth studying from an academic perspective?
I think so. I think there's a lot to take from it, because like it's probably the most I've studied a book in a long time. You're like, let's read this book and pull all the things out, and there were like certain theories that I could take from it, and like like I was saying, like the relevance to modern day about like, so there's a theory in it that a man is so attached to his bicycle that the bicycle becomes, say, 23% the man and vice versa. And like that, I was like, okay, that's relevant to today and phones and technology. So that was like the start. And that was like 1940s, so it was the closest to machines, like everyday machines that they would have dealt with. So I think there's a lot to pull from it. But
I think it like sort of like messes with its reader as well. Like De Selby, who's like noted in footnotes throughout as if they're an authority on something, is a completely fictional character. The vast majority of it is like mad pseudoscience. And not only do you have this fake scholar being cited, but you also have the main character themselves being like a student of this sort of like school of thought. And I think like there's probably a part of this that is like thumbing its nose almost to literary criticism in displacing this sort of like character in this into this realm of oddness and unreliability.
So one of the like theorists on this novel, a lot of the academic criticism on this talks a lot about what you were saying, Callum, about the atomic like transfer and basically a lot of theorists are like, oh yeah, so Flann O'Brien wrote this in response to Einstein and how the world changed and everyone's perception of how big things are shifted entirely. So that's why we have things like the minuscule boxes that are perfection and just scaled down versions of the larger box, or we have like the spear that is so thin and so sharp that the bit that actually points you and like hurts is like still 2 inches from the end of it because that's so thin it goes straight through your hand. So one of the like main academics that really studies O'Brien, a guy called Charles Chemnitz, he claims that it is the fully developed theory of quantum mechanics that governs the narration in The Third Policeman. Quantum mechanics is the atomic theory at work and doing untold destruction in the parish patrolled by Sergeant Pluck. But this is fiction, and all of everything that's discussed is complete pseudoscience. Like none of this is grounded in any kind of like actual scientific theory. But I think it kind of calls into question, like, so this was written post First World War, sort of before you have the atom bomb and everything that like came out of this. It sort of stands to reason. It's like how useful, like how can we draw the lines between fiction and science whenever it's all a case of like you have to believe in something that you can't even see.
That's true. And yeah, because it was so like new, when did you say Einstein was around? Like the 30s? So it was like maybe just Flann O'Brien catching wind of these discoveries and like giving his own 2 cents to it, being like, maybe it's this. I'll write in some fiction so no one thinks anything of it. But
so I would say that we have Omnium is like the crux of everything in this novel. It is pure science and also something that you have to have absolute faith in. And I wonder to sort of what extent, like, can you find God in this novel or religion? Like, this is Brian O'Nolan, Catholic man from Strabane that, as far as we know, never renounced his faith or anything like that. And he's like, oh, well, Omnium creates and destroys all things. And it's just like a substance that we can distill sounds and noises from. Like, do you think, like, in today's context, when we talk a lot about science and science is superior to religion because there's proof, it's kind of like, well, you can't see atoms.
I think it's like when they say, I think Sergeant Pluck is just like, basically says some people call it God, like Omnium, and I think it's sort of that line you draw where science is finding some answers. The universe is incredibly like huge and vast, and there's sort of like there are movements in it that some people strap the moniker God to sort of like explain them across everywhere, and I think that's sort of like his looking at that sort of like humans and the developments in physics giving humans more access to our neighbored universe, and to sort of like try and find the reasons of creation in there. And he has pulled omnium out and went, why not this? Why can't it be this?
Yep.
So I think you've got the policemen, the three policemen that are like incredibly powerful figures. They know where eternity is located. They can make these insane objects. They basically and literally can decide whether or not the narrator lives or dies. But how is it that them deciding on his execution reads like real life and normal and reasonable, but them knowing where like eternity is located isn't? Is it kind of like a commentary on how everyone has like some degree of power over their own existence?
Yeah. It's just like a comment on belief, really. Yeah. And like at the start, the main character, when he like falls into this realm, is very like skeptical of everything that these policemen are telling him, and they're talking about way off stuff. And then as it digresses, he falls into it, and it's just like, yeah, so this is reality now, and he's witnessed things that are pushing his perception. So it was, yeah, it's strange, like just how it progressed, like his belief in it. Like it ends him like going home being like, I have a box of omnium at home waiting for me, I'm sorted. So
yeah, because you kind of see that from the very beginning whenever he's like, I've lost my American gold watch. And as the novel progresses, he's like, I've lost my American gold watch. And Joe's like, you don't own a watch. His soul is like...
Joe being his soul, yeah.
Yes. His soul's like, no, you're lying to yourself.
Yeah.
But yeah, to go on to then the soul aspect of this, and the fact that his soul is his moral compass and corrects him on whether or not he has an American watch or not. That is something that I think is incredibly Irish in this novel. So we have, you know, as I said in the beginning, the description of the farmland, I think, is very Tyrone. The fact that eternity is down a little country lane sounds about right.
It's true.
But it's like, so we have all in Tyrone here now. We've got like Benedict Kiley over my shoulder. We're in God's own country. Is this a specifically Irish book?
I think you'd sort of like, obviously there is mention of Fermanagh and things like that, but you're never actually situated anywhere in it. But I think no one is going to mistake this for being a book set in Ireland. Like, just even in talking nonsense, they still speak with that regional, they still speak with that accent.
Yeah.
It's very recognizable in like the dialogue, and almost like, I definitely say the humor in it as well. It has that really, really dark comedy in it.
Yeah.
Which I find sort of like very, very common in sort of lots of Irish playwrights and guys, Martin McDonagh and things, Patrick McCabe, that sort of like dark comedy aspect that's like straight through here.
That's true. And yeah, the names alone are like McCrushkin, and in fairness, yeah, the Fermanagh man that went up in the hot air balloon was Quigley. And
But
some
even
Quigleys
still,
from Fermanagh.
it's like, it's Quigley and McCruskin, but it's Pluck and Joe, and there is a degree of universality to this.
Yeah.
I think, anyway. I definitely think we read it and we read about, you've got omnium, which means you could have strawberry jam up to the height of your two oxters.
That was one of the quotes.
Sounds like the dream, really.
Of your two youngsters. Yeah.
But at the same time, there is that like element of the text which is very much universal. Like, so one of the main things that I really enjoyed in it was how Mathers got around saying no to everything. He's like, I'll not go to hell because I'll just say no to everything. And then his friends ask him, well, you wouldn't say no to a glass of whiskey, would you? He's like, oh no, I suppose I wouldn't.
Yeah, that's a good Irish part of it. Like,
Yeah.
it's good and twisty.
Twisty, exactly, yeah. Yeah. So just to, I suppose, a conclusive thought. Do we think this is a philosophical text? Or did Brian O'Nolan go to the pub in Strabane with a few of his friends and just riff off everything that they talked about?
I feel like just because you're in the pub doesn't make it not philosophy.
Well, I agree wholly. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, guys, I suppose that's as good a place as any to
This is it.
finish it up. Thank you so much for your discussions and your thoughts. And yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
good night.
I'm here now with Nullag Casey, traditional artist in residence at University College Cork. Nullag is a renowned musician across Ireland, well known in both traditional and classical music. She has performed with musicians such as Van Morrison, Rod Stewart, and of course with her late husband, the renowned Omagh musician Artie McGlynn. Nullag is joined today by Artie's son, Jerome. Nullag, before I let you go get at it, we've been hearing so much today from writers and artists about how they sort of discovered their creative voice and then how they found an audience for that voice. I'm wondering, with all the variety that's been in your career, was there a particular moment, maybe early on, where a particular genre, type of music spoke to you in a way that you knew, I want to be a musician and I want to be a performer?
Well, it actually didn't happen as straightforwardly as that at all with me. I grew up in a family of traditional musicians from West Cork, and really heard very little music besides traditional music, except what I heard on the radio, until I was about 9 or 10. My mother arrived home with a fiddle for me and a harp for my sister, so I started playing by ear, and then my mother sent me to classical music lessons when I was about that age, and so I got into playing classical music, which I absolutely loved, people like Bach and Beethoven and all the rest of it. But meanwhile, I still kept playing traditional music. And then, so I grew up really playing both classical music and traditional music. And then I went on to do a degree in music in UCC, classical music. And then I went on I got a job with the RT Symphony Orchestra as a violinist. So I played with them for about 5 years. But while I was playing with the orchestra in Dublin, I started. There was a lot of traditional music in Dublin at the time, so I was playing a lot of sessions at night time, playing with the orchestra also, and I started to get a lot of work as a freelance musician, playing traditional music, but also an amalgamation maybe of my traditional music and classical music styles as well, and I suppose I was able to improvise and do arrangements and stuff like that. So I started to get more and more into that kind of music, playing for different records and film music as well. And then I met Artie, of course, and we started playing together. And that was it really. This was the kind of music, and myself and Artie played a lot of very different types of music, not just traditional music, kind of semi-classical music as well, bit of jazz, bit of this, bit of that, but just made our own sound, I suppose, with our own different influences.
And with all those influences and with the great variety of stuff you've done, do you find that what audiences in Ireland want has changed constantly over the years, and how have you sort of seen that evolution?
Yeah, well, when I started off playing professionally, we'll say, in the early 80s, there was still, especially maybe in the traditional music community, that if you stepped outside of that and you started adding a classical touch to something, it was still a bit, it wasn't really done really up to that point, but I suppose I started doing it, and then it became more and more accepted that people, as throughout the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, you have more and more and more professional bands. Originally there was Planksty and the Bothy Band, who were amazing, but nowadays there's some fantastic music out there. Traditional musicians who work maybe jazz into their music, or blues or classical music, and it's all very much accepted, and music has developed along those lines and is much more kind of it's more acceptable, I think, than it was when I was growing up. There was a bit of a kind of a snobbish attitude from classical musicians towards traditional music, and also vice versa. And I do believe that's kind of gone now, and it's opened up, and I think people are a lot more open-minded about the types of music they want to play, and also as regards the audiences are much more receptive, I think, now to people intermingling different styles, because it's all still music at the end of the day.
Brilliant. Well, wonderful to hear from you. I'll not hold you back anymore. Now look, Jerome, thanks so much for being here, and I'll let you play us out.
Okay. That was a piece of music that I composed a good few years ago at this stage. I was, myself and Artie had twin girls, and when they were very small girls, I was minding them and passing the time composing tunes, and that was one of the tunes I came up with. So I called it, I wasn't sure what to call it, and Orla, one of my daughters, she was about 2 or 3 at the time, told me that the tune reminded her of the fairies. So I decided to call it after a lovely little place where I grew up in West Cork called Lisnabanriana, and that means the fort of the fairy queen. So it's a bit of fairy music. The next tune I'm going to play is also a tune I composed, and I called it The Last Lord of Bera. It's a slow air, it's just going to be unaccompanied, and it's it's the story really of one of the O'Sullivan Bear chieftains who were defeated after the Battle of Kinsale, and he went on a march right up through the country, up as far as County Leitrim, and went into exile in Spain. So that's telling this story. It's called The Last Lord of Bera.